To begin, I'd like to introduce the first of our speakers, Claude Romano, Professor of Philosophy, Paris-Sorbonne, and Australian Catholic University, Sydney.
So thank you so much to Dilip for his kind invitation, for all the people behind the scenes who made possible this beautiful symposium, and of course, especially to Charles for being the philosopher he is and the human being he is. For me, it's a great pleasure, but also a great honor to be here. Charles Taylor is probably the living philosopher I admire the more and from whom I learned the more. There was a time when I was around 30 and I come from a continental European background and I was struggling to understand analytic philosophy because I thought that it would be absolutely crucial for me to understand what was going on there. And I discovered Charles Taylor's thought, and it was for me really a discovery because I could find that sort of generosity and at the same time simplicity in its capacity to formulate problems and also depth in his thinking that I found absolutely admirable and it is for me really a model in philosophy. So now I will shift to French because I think that it is important perhaps that French be represented here. Also because for Charles, it is one of his two languages, and because also his last book and all his books actually are always extremely attentive to the transition from one language to the other and have that big intercultural dimension. Donc, ce que je voudrais essayer de faire aujourd'hui, c'est pour rendre hommage à l'œuvre de Charles Taylor, non pas faire ce que j'ai entendu et qui était tout à fait, que j'ai beaucoup aimé, des présentations très générales avec un large panorama dans l'œuvre, mais faire en un sens, je ne me sentais pas capable de faire cela, mais faire plutôt quelque chose de beaucoup plus modeste, qui est une sorte de note de bas de page hein, que j'ajoute, ou que j'ose proposer d'ajouter à Cosmic Connections. Et je voudrais essayer de dire comment on pourrait peut-être développer légèrement différemment une notion qui est absolument centrale dans ce livre, il me semble, qui est cette notion d'insight, hein, un mot qui a ceci de particulier, je crois en anglais, comme le mot Stimmung en allemand, de désigner à la fois quelque chose de subjectif et quelque chose d'objectif, hein, c'est-à-dire à la fois une capacité à discerner, hein, une sagacité, et ce qui se révèle à travers cette capacité, c'est-à-dire une manifestation de quelque chose, un aspect, quelque chose de saillant. Et précisément, ce mot est si important dans la démarche de Charles Taylor, me semble-t-il, parce que ce qu'il cherche à montrer, c'est justement ce qu'il appelle aussi interspace, hein, très difficile à traduire en français, entre deux, on pourrait proposer. Donc le fait que la poésie ouvre un espace intervallaire, intermédiaire, hein, entre la subjectivité et le monde, et surtout nous reconnecte au monde. Et donc il y a cette image de l'insight qui peut rappeler certaines images de Heidegger, par exemple, aussi qui peut rappeler évidemment ce que Ricoeur dit de la métaphore, qu'elle donne à voir, qu'elle place sous les yeux, et déjà ce que Aristote disait de cette même métaphore quand il affirmait que précisément la métaphore place quelque chose sous les yeux, hein, pro-homaton, dit-il dans la rhétorique. La question que j'aimerais poser est la suivante. Ne touchons-nous pas avec cette dimension d'insight, puisque Charles Taylor appelle donc parle par exemple de la poésie en disant que elle open a new avenue of insight. C'est ça le langage poétique. Est-ce qu'avec cette dimension d'insight du poème, nous ne toucherions pas aussi à une sorte d'inexprimable qui, malgré tout, pourrait être exprimé? Et ce thème de l'inexprimable n'est pas très présent dans Cosmic Connections, alors qu'il est relativement présent dans la poétique romantique. Et, et donc, c'est pour ça que je parle d'une note de bas de page, c'est parce que je voudrais, au fond, essayer d'évoquer trois choses qui me semblent impliquées par ce que dit Charles Taylor dans son livre. D'une part, cette question de y a-t-il un inexprimable dans le poème? Deuxièmement, un auteur qui n'est pas très présent, alors que la poésie française est très présente, avec Baudelaire, avec Mallarmé, qui est Arthur Rimbaud. Et enfin, un philosophe qui n'est pas du tout présent, alors même qu'il est si important pour Charles, qui est Ludwig Wittgenstein. Il n'y a pas une seule mention. Et donc, je voudrais au fond un peu relier ces trois choses. Alors, il me semble que la pensée de l'ineffable a consisté souvent en Occident à considérer l'ineffable comme une limite externe au discours. Ce que le langage ne peut pas atteindre, ce qu'il ne peut donc pas dire. On pourrait en trouver une illustration, bien sûr, dans la tradition néoplatonicienne ou encore dans la théologie apophatique du pseudo-Denis. Certes, dans cette tradition, l'ineffable, qui est aussi un impensable, peut au moins se dire indirectement à travers une série de négations. Dieu n'est pas sage, mais au-delà de la sagesse, etc. Il n'en reste pas moins que l'ineffable y demeure essentiellement un dehors du discours, ce qui ne peut être approché à ce moment-là que par la négation d'attributs ou d'adjectifs comme celui-là. D'une certaine manière, c'est aussi ce que suggère le seul livre, sans doute, de philosophie au XXe siècle qui accorde une place centrale à la question de l'ineffable, qui est bien sûr le Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus de Wittgenstein, avec sa fameuse proposition finale, un numéroté 7, 7 n'est pas n'importe quel chiffre, qui est ce qu'on ne peut pas dire, il faut le taire, pour le traduire en français. À cette première conception de l'ineffable, ne faudrait-il pas en opposer une seconde? Ne faut-il pas essayer de penser à un inexprimable qui ne serait pas en excès par rapport au langage, mais qui lui serait en quelque sorte immanent? Non pas ce qui ne peut pas être dit, mais ce qui ne peut pas être dit autrement qu'il n'est dit, et donc ce qui ne peut pas être paraphrasé. Le poème n'est-il pas précisément une forme d'expression où les mots employés ne peuvent pas être remplacés par d'autres et défient toute paraphrase? L'ineffable n'est plus alors ce qui ne peut plus du tout se dire, puisque de fait, il se dit dans le poème repose sur un tel dire, mais plutôt ce qui ne peut pas se redire en dehors du poème, ce en quoi le dire et le dit coïncident absolument, ce qui instaure ainsi une forme d'adéquation quasi indissoluble entre le mot et la signification. Et je crois que cette question, elle est au centre de toute la poétique romantique qu'analyse de manière très riche, évidemment, ce livre, et notamment au centre de la théorie du symbole. L'essence de l'art, vont dire un certain nombre de romantiques, de Goethe jusqu'à Schelling, est de l'ordre du symbole et pas de l'ordre de l'allégorie. L'allégorie, c'est au fond quelque chose de fonctionnel, d'utilitaire, de dépourvu de valeurs propres. Donc il est très facile de paraphraser, par exemple, la balance pour représenter la justice, alors que le symbole, lui, est intransitif, il ne peut pas être dépassé complètement vers son sens, il est irremplaçable, il est informatif dans la mesure où il condense toute une richesse d'intuition qu'on ne peut pas dire autrement, et donc il se prête aussi à une exégèse infinie. Donc cette question du symbole, elle est centrale lorsque, par exemple, un certain nombre d'auteurs, je ne vais pas citer les textes, un certain nombre d'auteurs romantiques nous disent que justement ce qui caractérise le langage poétique, c'est l'impossibilité de dire les choses autrement. Cependant, cette impossibilité de dire les choses autrement, elle-même, est un peu troublante sur le plan philosophique. Qu'est-ce que cela veut dire au juste qu'un poème ne puisse pas être paraphrasé? Euh, Plusieurs réponses ici semblent se présenter. La première, peut-être la plus évidente, c'est de souligner l'indissociabilité du fond et de la forme dans le poème. Le fait que, précisément, comme le dit Paul Valéry dans Tel quel, le poème, cette hésitation prolongée entre le son et le sens. Euh, à ce moment-là, ce qui serait impossible à traduire, c'est justement cette adéquation particulière entre le son et le sens. Et c'est aussi, bien sûr, ce que dit Roman Jakobson, lorsqu'il parle de la fonction poétique du langage, qui consiste, dit-il, à mettre en exergue la matérialité du langage pour elle-même. Vous connaissez cette définition de la fonction poétique, la visée du message en tant que tel, l'accent mis sur le message pour son propre compte est ce qui caractérise la fonction poétique du langage. Seulement, cette première réponse semble aussi, par certains côtés, insuffisante. Elle semble insuffisante dans la mesure où il n'est pas si évident que dans un poème, on ne puisse pas remplacer une expression par une autre. N'est-ce pas ce que fait constamment le poète lorsqu'il crée? Et n'est-ce pas ce qui se passe lorsqu'il y a plusieurs versions d'un même poème? N'oublions pas tout de même que souvent les poètes écrivent plusieurs versions, et je vais justement en prendre un exemple. Donc ne faudrait-il pas dire plutôt que l'expression poétique est celle qui ne peut pas être remplacée par une autre, à moins d'être poète, à moins d'avoir un sens poétique? Donc, cette question, c'est celle des différentes versions, au fond, d'un poème. Et je voudrais prendre un exemple qui me semble très bien correspondre à ce que Charles Taylor veut montrer à propos de la poésie dans son ouvrage, qui est le poème de Rimbaud, Éternité, dont nous avons effectivement 3 ou 4 versions différentes, ceux qui ont été publiés dans différents contextes. Et notamment, je m'arrêterai simplement à la dernière strophe. Je ne choisis pas donc complètement ce poème au hasard, parce qu'au fond, ce que décrit cette strophe, cette expérience de l'éternité, c'est exactement à travers l'expérience de la mer et du soleil, c'est exactement le genre, me semble-t-il, de connexion cosmique dont parle l'ouvrage de Charles Taylor. Et d'ailleurs, dans une des versions de ce poème, celle que l'on trouve dans Alchimie du Verbe, le poème est introduit ainsi: j'écartais du ciel l'azur, qui est du noir, et je vécus l'étincelle d'or de la lumière nature. Donc il s'agit bien de cette connexion à la nature et à l'univers qui se joue. Donc voilà cette dernière strophe, je vous en lis 3 versions. Elle est retrouvée, quoi, l'éternité, c'est la mer allée avec le soleil. Dans un autre manuscrit autographe, on trouve, elle est retrouvée, quoi, l'éternité, c'est la mer mêlée au soleil. Et je prends une 3e version qui est citée dans une édition récente des œuvres de Rimbaud, qui est la suivante, qui est peut-être la plus étonnante. Elle est retrouvée, quoi, l'éternité, c'est la mer allée avec les soleils. Peut-on dire qu'une de ces versions est plus poétique que les autres, ou moins poétique, ou plus prosaïque? Je ne le crois pas. Celle qui mentionne plusieurs soleils est en effet sans doute la plus étonnante. Comment comprendre ce pluriel? S'agit-il d'une pluralité d'astres qui évoquerait peut-être l'infinité de la nature? S'agit-il plutôt de suggérer la myriade de petits soleils qui miroitent sur la mer, multipliés par sa surface? Quoi qu'il en soit, l'argument de l'impossibilité de paraphraser le poème se heurte ici à la multiplicité des variantes d'un même texte, même si ces variantes sont proches. Une autre réponse, peut-être que celle que j'ai essayé d'avancer, cette union du fond et de la forme, serait la suivante. L'impossibilité de paraphraser le poème viendrait de ce que la poésie emploie différemment le langage que le langage de tous les jours, selon, pourrait-on dire, une autre logique que celle qui préside au langage ordinaire en tant que langage instrumental. Le langage est ici employé comme un moyen d'expérimenter des aspects de la signification, et ici aspect pourrait être traduit par insight ou insight, euh, des aspects de la signification qui ne peuvent pas surgir au sein de phrases ordinaires. Alors, il serait, me semble-t-il, à cet égard intéressant justement de réintroduire Ludwig Wittgenstein. Je disais un peu vite tout à l'heure que Ludwig Wittgenstein a pensé à un ineffable qui serait une limite au fond externe à ce qu'on peut dire. Mais en réalité, c'est beaucoup plus subtil et complexe que cela, car Wittgenstein ne s'est pas contenté de dire, comme dans la dernière proposition, qu'il fallait réserver l'ineffable au silence. Dans une lettre à son ami Paul Engelmann, il va s'exprimer autrement et cette formule m'intéresse particulièrement. Engelmann affirme que Wittgenstein aimait passionnément la poésie, qu'il aimait beaucoup Goethe, qu'il aimait Mihirete, qu'il aimait Gottfried Keller, et même qu'il récitait en frissonnant certains vers de celui-ci. Et on se souvient aussi que Wittgenstein, lors d'une fameuse séance avec le Cercle de Vienne, qu'il invitait pour parler du Tractatus, s'est contenté à ce moment-là de leur lire un poème de Rabindranath Tagore, en lieu et place de la conférence qu'ils espéraient. Or, Wittgenstein semble précisément faire du poème, même s'il a très peu écrit en fait sur le sujet, l'un des lieux avec la métaphysique où l'animal loquens cherche à se mesurer aux limites du langage. Cette confrontation à l'ineffable est peut-être même à ses yeux la caractéristique principale du poème, et cela dès la période du Tractatus. Le poème chercherait justement à dire l'inexprimable, et donc à brouiller les limites de l'exprimable et de l'inexprimable, en faisant un emploi du langage qui le pousse à ses limites. Mais contrairement à la philosophie, cet effort renouvelé ne serait pas infructueux, mais au contraire la source des plus grandes réalisations. Et c'est ce qui ressort d'une lettre du 9 avril 1917, qui est peut-être, je ne connais pas parfaitement Wittgenstein, mais qui est peut-être la seule lettre où il commente véritablement un poème, qui est donc cette lettre qu'il envoie à son ami, et qui dit ceci. Le poème d'Uland, Ludwig Uhland, le poète du 19e siècle, est vraiment magnifique. Il en est ainsi. Si on ne cherche pas à exprimer l'inexprimable, alors rien n'est perdu. L'inexprimable est plutôt inexprimablement contenu dans l'exprimé. Et c'est cette dernière formule que je trouve étonnante. L'inexprimable est inexprimablement contenu dans l'exprimé. On pourrait commenter cette étonnante formule en disant qu'elle marque justement le passage d'une conception de l'ineffable comme limite ou comme dehors du langage à une conception positive comme ineffable interne au langage lui-même. Selon cette lecture, le poème ne cherche pas à proprement parler à exprimer l'inexprimable, ce qui est impossible d'après le Tractatus, mais plutôt, avec tout ce que cette formule a de paradoxal, à exprimer inexprimablement l'inexprimable ou à exprimer l'inexprimable sans le rendre pour autant exprimable, c'est-à-dire en le manifestant ou en le montrant. Et on retrouve ici l'insight, la monstration. Or, ce que Wittgenstein formule ici, condense ici en une seule formule, on pourrait être tenté. Alors, je ne sais pas combien il me reste de temps. How much time do I have?
Actually gone by 20.
Uh,
You've actually gone a bit over already.
okay, so I will end with a few words. Donc, on pourrait, c'est ce que je ne ferai pas, on pourrait essayer de montrer comment cette thématique est reprise dans quelques remarques à la fin des recherches philosophiques, notamment des remarques où Wittgenstein, alors c'est très surprenant, me semble-t-il, ce qu'il dit, il parle au fond d'un autre concept de signification, dont il dit bien que ce n'est pas celui dont il parle fondamentalement dans les recherches philosophiques, c'est-à-dire la signification, c'est l'usage. Un autre concept de signification dans lequel le langage est employé comme une forme de peinture. Et il prend cela très au sérieux, hein, non pas du tout pour écarter cela en disant c'est un emploi métaphorique de la signification, c'est pas vraiment de la signification, mais au contraire en disant que effectivement c'est un emploi possible de la signification, mais que cet emploi ne relève pas exactement du genre d'analyse que lui-même a donné jusque-là. Et je voudrais juste conclure en citant deux exemples, chez Rimbaud encore, hein, justement qui montrent cet emploi où c'est l'expérience d'un aura de signification propre aux mots qui est l'enjeu poétique. Un premier emploi, c'est une métaphore, donc c'est quelque chose qui est encore assez classique, on pourrait dire. C'est cette phrase de Rimbaud qui dit « Je devins un opéra fabuleux ». Hein, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire devenir un opéra? Alors on peut le comprendre, effectivement, on peut essayer de le paraphraser. C'est effectivement avoir une forme d'illumination qui est du type de celle que propose un opéra avec à la fois ses dorures, ses décors peints, etc., et sa musique, tout cela ensemble. Bon, on pourrait paraphraser, mais vous voyez comment ici l'image, évidemment, est comme une peinture en quelque sorte ramassée. Mais l'exemple qui m'intéresse le plus, c'est celui de la strophe que je vous ai lue, c'est-à-dire des multiples soleils. Parce que justement, il n'y a pas de métaphore ici. L'emploi de soleil au pluriel n'est en rien une métaphore, et pourtant, un nom propre est employé au pluriel pour désigner quoi? La démultiplication de cette étoile par les vagues, l'ivresse que procure au poète l'impression d'éternité, qui le place en présence d'une infinité de soleils, ou peut-être encore la connexion cosmique avec l'infinité de l'univers stellaire. Et voilà.
Well, thank you to everyone, and I hope what I have to say will make it clear enough how enormously meaningful it is for me to participate in this wonderful event. I first met Charles Taylor in 1994, but I had met him in writing several years before that. Like many others in the room, having read two Hegel books and Sources of the Self. As Craig said last night, Charles's personal voice is enormously present in his writing. On the other hand, meeting him in person and developing a kind of face-to-face dialogue and friendship adds a kind of avalanche effect to the whole phenomenon, because when one has the privilege of knowing both writing and the person, the generosity, originality, and power really come out. And that's, in my case, despite the fact that I think we're wired fundamentally differently. And so the communication between the two of us, not to make them symmetrical, but the relationship between me as a younger colleague and Charles has a very high degree of counterpoint, to use a musical example. One of my fields is music. I believe that music is a source not only of feeling and form, but also of knowledge. And so I tend to use musical vocabulary from time to time. And it's Edward Said who used the terms counterpoint and contrapuntality to talk about this power of dialogue between two registers that remain fundamentally different, but have a great deal to say to each other, and where ultimately that kind of communication is really what's going on. Let me illustrate my own position through two very brief anecdotes. The first one involves an episode about 15 years ago where I found myself in a hospital bed for a few days. And at one point in the afternoon, I woke up to find standing in front of me a clergyman, total Central Hollywood casting, silver hair and collar, asking me whether he could talk to me. And I said, I'm very happy to talk to you, but I don't really know what the ultimate result will be. And he asked me if he could ask me what my religion was. And I was somewhat taken aback, and I said, more or less accurately, but with, I think, a great deal of inadequacy, well, I guess I'm a secular Jew. To which he responded, well, we have a Jewish rabbi here, if you'd like to speak to him. And I managed to call up enough self-discipline not to say, is there any other kind? I didn't, but I did say, and I really believe I did say this, but do you have a secular Jewish rabbi? The conversation ended soon, very politely, I have to say. So that's the first anecdote. The second one is a kind of tribute to both Charles and Aube, but in this case, actually more to Aube than to Charles. And that is a few years after our initial meeting in the mid-90s. I was walking with my father in New York City, and to my great pleasure came across both Aube and Charles, and we spoke for a few minutes, and we both went on. And several years after that, Aube said how much of a pleasure it was to see the two of us together, and how somehow the father and son presence, even over a few minutes, had really made an impression. I was enormously touched by that, and I've always remembered that, that you said that, and it has something to do with the self-definition that I'm attempting. So my father and my mother were both born in Germany in the 1920s, and in the early Nazi period emigrated. They didn't know each other, but they emigrated through Belgium, France, Cuba, and they met in New York, where I was born, in a quadrilingual family, but one that maintained that definite interest in multilinguality, but where English was the lingua franca at home. But they had a very different kind of residual relationship to religion and to ritual, especially following their experiences. My father, like his father before him, had come out of emigration in World War II with an enormous skepticism and discomfort about any kind of ritual experience, as if nothing he ever articulated, but as if it was a kind of way of losing part of the self that you needed for self-preservation and survival. While my mother, on the other hand, needed a certain amount of ritual to reintroduce her to a world that was very different from the many different worlds that she had come to know. And I somehow wound up more on my father's side in terms of this personal experience, and the secular and secularity have both become really terms of reference, both personally and in my own scholarship, but their definitions and usefulness have remained very fluid and very unclear. I think of secularity not as simply a condition, but as a historical process, and one where religion is more displaced than replaced, and where there's a nostalgia for it, but also a kind of fear of it, and specifically a fear of ritual. I think the enormous well of to mix metaphors, of mediation between the secular and the sacred, and I prefer the term sacred to religious, and we can get into that, is in fact the aesthetic, and the aesthetic constitution of the world, the aesthetic constitution of the self in relation to the world, though it's not without its significant dangers. And here, when I reread a book that has been mentioned, but hasn't gotten the kind of mention possibly because it's so much shorter than Charles's books that have been mentioned, when I reread The Ethics of Authenticity, to me this is a kind of go-to book to refresh my own political judgment about the aesthetic, the Schillerian aesthetic education of man, and the place of the aesthetic in the psychic world, but also the political world, where I think it mediates between the secular and the sacred, but again, not without danger. So when Charles writes that authenticity is itself an idea of freedom, he opens up a kind of avenue into exploring what is authentic that breaks through much of the taboo in the last 20 or 30 years around the question of authenticity. It restores a dimension of being that I find absolutely essential. And he then goes on to describe it, as I recall, in two dimensions. One, the combination of expressivity and self-creation, and two, quote, the openness to horizons of significance, end quote. And this I take as a plea for a dialogue with others against a radical atomism. He uses the term atomism, and he uses, I think, a somewhat more idiosyncratically anthropomorphism as a synonym for atomism. So this to me is a restoration of this aesthetic view of constitution and self-constitution, but one that avoids what to me as a 19th century person is the great danger of this approach, and that is what, for better or for worse, I would call aestheticism. In other words, the idea of remaking the world as a kind of aesthetic project or aesthetic object. Here, the so-called black hole of the 19th century, and you'll see my own musical dimension here, is Wagner, is Richard Wagner, a figure of enormous importance, enormous depth of psychological insight, and also a great menace in constructing an aesthetic view of the world that goes back to myth, that goes back to fantasy, expressible in music, but not in language. And that ultimately constitutes a world where systematic racism is possible, and this not to be completely distinguished from an aesthetic vision. So when we talk about a category like the cosmic, the political question in my mind becomes how the cosmic avoids this kind of aestheticism, which is its ultimate danger. And one position, one philosophical and political position that has meant a lot to me is a view of Avishai Margalit, a philosopher for whom what is most important is the distinction between what he calls thick relations and thin relations. Thick relations being relations of intense community and bonds, such as family, lover. He uses the term countryman, which is kind of old-fashioned in a very interesting way, and thin relations being the relationship among humans, where the capacity of recognizing the stranger and building a bond that is not destined or predestined in any way, but is politically necessary. I'm very sympathetic to this view, and then I ask myself, where is the role of the aesthetic and the aesthetic constitution of this kind of communication and relationship? And here in reading Cosmic Connections, I find a lot of answers and a lot of questions on this topic. I was particularly moved by the passages toward the end of the book on Marcel Proust, someone I've been. Everybody did something during COVID. I finally read all of Proust, and I'm now trying to write something about it. And what Charles says about Proust and the sense of higher time, in the sense of a cosmic connection, especially in response to the end of the great novel, Le Temps Retrouvé, the last chapters, is, of course, profoundly true. I mean, what we find here is a kind of synthesis, an aesthetic synthesis of art and life. And then the question is, which is my question, how to avoid the dangers of this kind of aestheticism, which I find politically dangerous and kind of, in an affective way, actually sincerely scary. And here, I think that there's an entire different dimension of Proust that goes all the way through this novel, which I think is considered much more rarely, but equally important, and that's the situation of mundane politics, the everyday life of politics, the enormous cataclysms of history from the 1890s through the First World War, which are described both on a kind of macro level, but more ordinarily on a kind of micro level of people's recollections and memories and conversations that they have. And the moment in the novel which, to use a kind of Freudian term, I would consider the navel of the novel, with this emphasis on the mundane and political rather than the aesthetic and the kind of synthetic at the end, is a moment involving the Prince de Guermantes, not a major character in the novel, at a moment that is, of course, recollected through several mediations, a moment where he, as is reported later, has an absolute need for a conversation with Charles Swann, right? The kind of half-Jewish hero, anti-hero of a good deal of the novel. And in this conversation, as it's reported through several mediations, it became absolutely essential for him to tell Swann that he, the Prince de Guermantes, had changed his mind about the Dreyfus affair and about Alfred Dreyfus. So the Prince de Guermantes, as a Parisian aristocrat, one of the great grande famille, had been educated to be a Catholic and anti-Semite and someone who honors the military as the soul of France. And through this fundamental change, which has really overcome him based on evidence, he decides he's made up his mind, and he has to report this to Swann, that Dreyfus was in fact innocent, which in fact shatters his cosmology, right? It shatters his whole sense of the political and the moral world. And this has started me thinking a question which I don't yet control and certainly don't have an answer to, but which I would call the politics of changing one's mind. One of the many questions is this an internal process, or is it by definition a kind of participation in some kind of political process? And I think there are several contexts, and I'll end with this, several difficult contexts in the world today, which you may infer from my own family biography, that seem to require a kind of fundamental changing of the mind in ways that for many people are extraordinarily painful. There was an essay in the New York Review of Books about 6 months ago by Arya Nair, one of the founder of Human Rights Watch, where he said, not exactly in these terms that I've been describing, but I think very close to them, that he has changed his mind, that he has come to the conclusion that a genocide is taking place in Gaza. And the way he expressed this view was analytical. He gave his reasons, but also emotional in the sense of what he had gone through to come to this decision and how enormously painful it was. And as I want to suggest, I think that's one, but I think there are several issues that are obsessing all of us today, where the counterbalance of the aesthetic is this kind of hard political inner decision of very often changing one's mind, but where political communities need to be rethought according to unpredicted solidarities, unpredicted forms of community that generations and historical constitutions really are no longer capable of providing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dilip and Jocelyn, for inviting me. For me, it is indeed a little bit relieving finally to have the possibility to say thanks to you, Charles. And I want to explore a little bit Charles as a teacher. I work in the field of philosophy of education, and I want to start with something that Charles did not do. Charles Taylor never developed a systematic theory of education. Nevertheless, one feature of his life work is that he has educated and still educates people, primarily as a university teacher, but perhaps more broadly as a social philosopher. A short remark to the term of education. Education is meant here in a broader sense, in the tradition of the German notion of Bildung. And Bildung means that Bildung is a formation of a relationship to oneself and to the world that is directed towards an ideal of a fulfilled life. So it's more than just instruction or teaching. The German philosopher Axel Honneth wrote that doing social philosophy is a substantial educational activity. The description and criticism of social and cultural developments and the ideas that drive them aims to inform and to teach and somehow also to educate its members about the structural conditions of their lives. It is also concerned with the question how we can learn to understand our cultural situation better and more adequately, and hence educate ourselves to find better
solutions to handle the challenges and conflicts that are inherent in this situation, and possibly create better conditions of leading a fulfilled life. I never studied in one of Charles' seminars. Other participants have, and they have said something about that. Therefore, I do not want to talk about his teaching skills or student counseling, but something I find remarkable, and I think this is a good occasion to honor it, is the implicit educational power that comes with his kind of philosophy and the way he addresses its phenomena. Moreover, Charles' thoughts have profound implications for how we might grow as individuals and as communities in the face of our specific existential predicaments. I would like to highlight three principles in his work. These principles are philosophical topics, but they are also principles that I think they are educational principles. These principles are the notion of the good, the language of resonance, and the power of articulation. And I highlight these three principles because they had a huge impact on my own understanding of education. Okay, the first, the notion of the good. One aspect of Charles Taylor's work that has had and continues to have a major impact on philosophical and public debates is undoubtedly what he calls the recovery of the good. As human beings, we do not only have preferences, needs, or desires, nor can our humanity be exhaustively described by the fact that we have second-order wishes, a rational desire to have or not to have certain desires, as Harry Frankfurt argued. For Charles Taylor, the crucial characteristic of the human subject is that we evaluate our preferences, desires, and needs and actions, and that some of these evaluations are so deep and categorical that they define us. They define the way who we are, what person we are. They are the strong evaluations. According to Taylor, we cannot understand human action without taking into account the strong evaluations of the person. I was a student when I first read Self-Interpreting Animal, the paper in which Charles Taylor introduces the idea of strong evaluations. And I remember that I couldn't see the world with the same eyes after I read that. And I think that some of his texts have this transformative power. You see the world in a different light, or yourself in a different light. The change of outlook took place on an intellectual level. But at the beginning and during this reading, where I really didn't understand all of his arguments, something happened on an affective level. I think that this way of arguing and addressing problems can open up a more positive, affirmative, not demeaning understanding of why people from different social classes, ethnic groups, or family backgrounds have such different, sometimes contradictory notions of how to lead a life and how to solve problems, how to address problems. Our identities and life concepts are not effects of faceless societal dispositives, nor are they the result of cold functional imperatives. They are not just given and guided by an instrumental outlook, and they are not fully constructed by our own subjective capacities. Instead, identities, ideals, and life concepts are articulations and expressions of what we feel is deeply valuable and of worth for us and maybe for others. And I'm convinced that this understanding can open up the mind for a deeper understanding and interest in the existential struggles that we are all involved in, and realizing a certain ideal of the good life. This mindset can help us become more tolerant and sensitive to plurality and diversity, and can help us to recognize the other in a fuller sense. I think that this is one of the reasons why Charles Taylor's reflections are so inviting and encouraging to learn more about ourselves and about others and about our cultural situation. I also believe that such an open attitude to diversity and sensitivity to strong evaluations of the other person is essential for every educational account that wants to help people to flourish and grow, because it has something to do with how open we are for the other and how we understand the other. The second principle, the principle of personal resonance. The second principle is related to the first one. How do we analyze our strong evaluations and moral sources, as Charles did in the Sources of the Self? And in the final chapters of Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor writes that to do this, we need a language of resonance. We cannot understand the moral order by describing reality in a neutral and naturalistic way, because we would fail to see that subjective experiences, we would fail to see the subjective experience that something is of value to us. Nor can we use a language that is merely an instrument for subjective self-expression. We would miss then the fact that our ethical convictions and moral goods demand something of us that goes beyond our own selves. For Charles Taylor, a language that explores the moral landscape is an in-between language. It needs to do both. We need a language for the exploration of order through personal resonance. And I think this term is really central to all of his work. Charles Taylor writes at the end of Sources of the Self, I have throughout sought language to clarify the issues, and I have found this in images of profound personal resonance. And this principle, exploring order through personal resonance, is not just an abstract philosophical assumption, but a lived intellectual practice. In the summer of 2012, Charles Taylor was awarded the Schiller Professorship at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. It was there that we've met the first time. Around the year 1800, Jena and nearby Weimar were cities where many of Taylor's reference authors, such as Herder, Hegel, Goethe, Schiller, and Novalis, have lived and worked. And I will never forget how my fellow colleague and student Dario Montero and I, together with Charles, his wife Orb, and his sister Greta, explored the places of these philosophers. There I realized that exploring order through personal resonance was not just a concept in his books, but a feature of his person. It is a way of intellectual being, a mode of personal encounter, of sharing thoughts and experiences, of bringing people together and creating contact with the environment. This experience was very influential for me as a student. It was a point where I understood that teaching has so much more to do with personal resonance than doing instructions, giving instrumental help, or the transfer of knowledge, handing over bricks to another person, as John Dewey described it. I'm convinced that every good teacher must have some form of ability to explore issues, themes, and subjects together with his students through personal resonance. And based on the work of the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, he's a teacher of mine, I've even developed an educational theory in which resonance is the key concept. There's another aspect that I think it's pretty interesting. Charles Taylor came back a couple of years later to Jena, I think it was 2017, as a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies, Post-Growth Societies. We did an interview about culture, identity, and education, where a colleague of mine and we confronted Charles with questions from educational theory. And there he mentioned another aspect of what I take to be an educational part of exploring order through personal resonance. He called it the transitional criteria. We talked about whether there could be a criteria that can be used to distinguish good from bad developments in educational processes. So Bildung or formation means that we are transforming somehow, but how can you say that the transformation is a good transformation or a bad transformation? What criteria is there? And here comes a longer quote from Charles. By a criterion, people usually mean some standard outside of the particular development, which can tell us that this is a good development because it leads to there, and this is a bad development because it leads to there. Certainly, up to a point, this is the case. But the main way we know that we are moving ahead is internal to the transition itself, that is undergone. When you live through the transition, you live through how the transition comes about. Therefore, the kind of education that produces real Bildung has to be judged according to some criteria, but the ultimate judge must be the experience of the people who undergo it and think that, for instance, it helped them immensely or did not. To be open, when I read Sources of the Self or other texts of Charles Taylor, I have the impressions of being continuously in personal resonance with the text. And in my view, this resonance experience and the transformative power of this reading, which I probably share with many others who have studied his books, stems from the fact that Charles takes this internal criteria, this transitional criteria, so seriously in his argumentations. He guides the reader through such transitions, not only individual transitions, but also cultural transitions. Okay, third, the transformative power of articulation and expression. The third principle is one that I find particularly intriguing, namely the concept of articulation and expression. Expression and moreover articulation are key concepts in Charles Taylor's theoretical framework concerning language, human action, epistemology, selfhood, and culture. If one, like me, is seeking the implicit theory of education in his work, it would be equally beneficial to focus on the concept of human expressiveness. Charles Taylor's reflections are driven by the convictions that the human realm of meaning is not just there, but articulated and expressed. As human beings, we interpret reality and make it manifest through expression. This implies that emotions and values, beliefs and ideas, life goals and identities are not simply given or constructed. They are always both found and made, explored and created at the same time. This is one crucial structural element of articulation. And I think it resonates or echoes with exploring order. Something is found, something is given. By personal resonance, something is created and made. They are always both found and made, explored and created at the same time, these human meanings. As expressive beings, we humans are always already situated within a world that is in some way meaningful to us and that embodies meaning for us. As a result, we are able to discern and perceive the significance of various phenomena. But often we start with just an inchoate sensation or impression of what it is that appears to be important. We come to terms and get a clearer understanding of what this lived experience is about by articulating and unfolding its meaning more clearly and nuanced. According to Charles Taylor, this process is never be sufficient because new sensations, experiences, and articulations can occur that alter and change our initial understanding. Therefore, we are interwoven in an ongoing process of expressing and articulating meaning. What Charles Taylor adds to the theory of expression is the extension of this process to a cultural formative moral orders of goods and value-based concepts of identity. But if this is correct, then it can be argued that it is through process of expressions and articulation that we can learn who we are, what the foundations of our communities consist in, and what life is really about. Hence, expressivity is a driving force for every learning process. This provides an impulse for educational theory that can hardly be overestimated. For imparting a reasoned belief in the good, for the intellectual and personal resonance, and for fostering an environment of open articulation and expression, I will always be thankful.
All right. Hi, everyone. Okay, so it's an immense pleasure to speak at this event. It's not an exaggeration to say that there's no contemporary philosopher that had a greater impact on my own thought than Chuck's. I discovered your work when I was an undergrad, and I was a first generation, university student. So I was trying to find my bearings, but I had acquired kind of a passion for French and German phenomenology and existentialism, as many young men, right? So that was kind of the background, and I started my undergraduate studies, and I some of my teachers directed me to Chuck's work in different areas of contemporary philosophy, and I could see I was discovering contemporary analytic philosophy through his work, and I could see that it connected with different more continental traditions. I was also interested in political affairs and political philosophy also, and that was exactly during the years that led to the second referendum on Quebec's sovereignty. So when I was in class, I was studying the liberal and communitarian debate. And Chuck, of course, was one of the main voices in that debate. And outside class, we were debating issues around nationalism, liberalism, pluralism, the right to self-determination of minority nations, people, and so on. So it was a perfect environment to really become passionate about these issues, and both as a philosopher that I was reading in my classes, and as a public intellectual, also, Chuck was participating in these discussions with also some of his, students that were becoming junior academics, in different institutions here. So it was a very wonderful intellectual environment. It's also in these years that I read the Malaise of Modernity, that became one of my favorite books back then. And from there, I made my way to the Hegel books, to Source of the Self. And I remember fondly discussions with Nigel that we heard this morning. We both did our MA at the University of Victoria under Jim Tully's supervision, and we had long discussions on all the concepts, developed in Sources of the Self or the philosophical papers. That was also one of my best memories of my graduate education. And I had the privilege of meeting Charles in person for the first time when I was in Victoria doing my MA, because after my BA at Laval University in Quebec City, I thought about coming to McGill, but that's exactly when you retired. So I was really, really disappointed about that. But then I went to UVic, and you came, gave a lecture, and the kind of generosity that we heard, since this morning, that's exactly what I experienced. And I was just, kind of stunned that such a philosophical giant was expressing interest in the ideas that I had back then as a MA student. And since then, Obe and Chuck always supported me, encouraged me to chart my own path in academia and in public life as well. And I will always be grateful for the two of you for these encouragement. I'm not sure I needed that kind of support at that point. And a bit later, when I was junior faculty member in philosophy at Laval University, I had the extraordinary privilege of working closely with Chuck during the Bouchard-Taylor Commission as an analyst. And although the political context was extremely loaded and difficult, and it was very demanding, but it's still, again, some of my best, most rewarding professional experience, because every day in, day out, we would discuss, what's the meaning of laicité, political secularism, freedom of conscience and religion, reasonable accommodation, and so on. And these issues were very both theoretically difficult, but also we had to come up with recommendations, right, to the government. And we were criticized by many in the public sphere and so on. So, notwithstanding this context, it was an extremely rewarding experience, and I'm very happy that we could put all the ideas that we crafted together in these dialogues in that short book, Secularism and Freedom of Conscience. Okay, so what I want to do now is that we know that the themes that Chuck's explore in his many books are extremely rich and important, and they'll stay with us for many decades to come. But what I want to also suggest is that even themes that are not central to his body of work, when you think about them, you realize at some point that there's other Taylorian insights that are incredibly valuable and insightful and useful to think about issues that are not central to his work. So since we published Secularism and Freedom of Conscience together, I turned to my attention to two set of philosophical problems. The first set has to do with our basic finitude, death and dying, different conceptions of what a good death is within the broader conception of the good life, of the meaningful life. And that was triggered by the legalization here in Canada of medical aid in dying. So that's the first set of issues. And the second one is about all the philosophical questions raised by progress in artificial intelligence. And that's what I've been mostly focusing on in the past few years because of how AI technologies progress that are now, parts of all pretty much spheres of human life. So in both these two sets of questions, I didn't think at the beginning that I would draw from Chuck's body of work. I had no explicit intention of doing it, but I realized as I was trying to articulate my own views that in both cases they could help me. So I'll just focus on AI because it would be too long to tackle both. So I suppose that's not surprising, but it's not something that was conscious and explicit and intentional on my part. But let me give you one example. So as you all know now, I'm sure, progress in artificial intelligence research and development has been extremely impressive and rapid in the past decade. There used to be a time, right, where we were talking about the AI winter. It was not progressing at all. It was kind of a dead research agenda. And all of a sudden, in the 2010s, it took off again. So I was curious, why is it there's that renaissance of the AI research agenda? And I noticed that it was that impressive progress was raising very interesting questions in pretty much all branches of philosophy, right? From the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, how do we do science now, to ethics and other field of practical philosophy because of how these systems are used, right? But some of these philosophical questions are very speculative. But people in AI and then in technoscience are trying to ponder very speculative questions, and I think that philosophers should participate in that discussions. And two of the most speculative philosophical questions that are being discussed are about, okay, so where is AI going, and what kind of what's the cognitive level that it can reach, basically. And most in the AI world are trying to develop what they call AGI. That's artificial general intelligence, okay, AGI. So it's general in the sense that artificial, they call it agents, would have cognitive capacities as varied as those demonstrated by humans. So basically that's human level intelligence, and most of them think that it's actually achievable, that it will be reached, that the chances are that it will be attained at some point, and that that AI won't stop there, right? That it will go beyond humans. So that's super intelligence. Okay, and I thought at the beginning, surely these are like fringe views, kind of sci-fi inspired and so on, but they're not. Those who are actually, the reason why AI develops so much, the pioneers and so on, they think, especially since, we had better access to the large language models that powers, say, chatbots like ChatGPT and so on, many things that we're coming close, right? That it could take 5 years, 10 years. Some say a bit more, but some now say as little as 5 years where AGI will be reached. Okay, so that's about the cognitive powers of AI. That's one speculative question. The other one is about whether or not they could become true agents and acquire consciousness, okay, or sentience, depending on the others. But many think that they could also acquire the kind of subjective experiences that we associate with conscious experience, right? The subjective experience that we have when we, give a lecture or have a coffee with a friend and so on. So all these, what we call sometimes qualia or qualitative experience that we have because we're conscious, it feels like something, right? To be us, to have a subjective standpoint and so on. And many serious thinkers, scientists, think that that's also possible, that AI at some point, if not already, but that's a very minority view, but that at some point consciousness could also emerge, within artificial intelligence system. Okay, so I'm not making this up. So perhaps you heard that recently a Canadian researcher called Jeff Hinton at U of T won a Nobel Prize in Physics. I'm not sure why he won a Nobel Prize in Physics, but anyhow, he did. But he's one of the godfathers of deep learning in AI research. That's a new paradigm in AI research. And he gave an interview to the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago, and he said, that's Hinton speaking, what I want to talk about is the issue of whether chatbots like ChatGPT understand what they're saying. A lot of people think that chatbots, even though they can answer questions correctly, don't understand what they're saying. That it's just a statistical trick. And he adds, that's complete rubbish. They really do understand, and they understand the same way that we do. Okay, so that's what he said, and he added, there isn't any spooky stuff in the way that the mind works. By spooky stuff, he meant, as a journalist saying, he meant secret or mysterious mental processes that couldn't be analyzed and transformed into replicable actions. And he added, I don't buy spooky stuff. I think it's rubbish. I think it's just a denial of the fact that we are material and that we live in a material world. And quote, this is one of the top AI researchers, and I have many colleagues in philosophy also who think that's a plausible view, right? It's not that we know that's going to happen, but that it's a plausible candidate. Upon reflection, I came to the view that both states are implausible, that AI will reach AGI on the one hand, and that and these can be separated, right? You could have highly cognitively sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that are not conscious, or they could come together as they do for humans, right? Both are possible, but I think that both kind of achievements are implausible. In a Taylorian spirits, I do think that we need to engage seriously, right, with the views of those who think that it's highly plausible. And of course, there are good reasons why we should think seriously about it, right? One of them is that for instance, we don't know why, how consciousness emerge in human beings and other animals, right? There's no scientific theory of consciousness, of what are the conditions under which it emerges in a particular, entity. It emerge in living organisms. Perhaps there are other material conditions that could give rise to consciousness. Okay, so one of the basic assumptions for both AGI and conscious AI is that one of the premises here is that you have to accept the idea of what they call substrate independence, right? So there's a substrate for either higher forms of intelligence or consciousness. Let's say that you start from a naturalist or materialist point of view, right? There's only matters and the laws of nature and so on. You bracket everything else. So those who think that we have to accept substrate independence think that, well, so intelligence and consciousness emerge, on the basis of, human brain or animal brains and body and so on among living organisms, there could be another material substrate that could do it as well. And then you have to have a theory of kind of the mind that says that yes, there are some underlying process. Perhaps it's just about computation, right? So there's a reemergence of what we call sometimes computational functionalism, but really it's a new form of behaviorism, basically, right? So you think that, okay, so the large language models, they produce very good outputs, right? They answer our questions and they create meaningful, intelligible text. So if the output is good, then you have to attribute the same kind of properties to the artificial minds, even if these systems work very differently. Okay, my time is almost up, so I'll just conclude by saying that how did I came to the view that both were implausible? Well, it was by going back to some of Chuck's work on embodied cognition and embodied agency, right? So I reread the chapter on Merleau-Ponty and the companion to Merleau-Ponty, the validity of of transcendental arguments also. So if you take embodied cognition seriously, that gives you kind of a platform to develop arguments for saying, not proving that it won't happen, but to be skeptical about the plausibility of such a scenario. So I guess that I'm trying to develop a kind of a new quasi-transcendental arguments, so showing that how both embodied and embedded, cognition or agency, the embodied and embedded character of our, cognitive capacities gives us reason to doubt that these kind of state can be realized on the basis of a very different platforms. And I'll conclude by saying, though, so I think that philosophers should participate in these very speculative discussions that are taking place, but they're not only speculative. Those who think that it's very plausible that AI will reach these levels, of course, they think that this has some practical implications also, because one of them is that it could create what they call an existential threat to humanity, right? So if you have artificial systems that are even more intelligent than humans, how do you keep control over these systems? It's very difficult to see how do you control a more intelligent entity. And the other issue that is raised by those who take this possibility seriously is the moral status of AI also, right? If they become conscious, they could suffer. Also, they could have interests of their own, so they could have like intrinsic moral worth. So some are saying that we should already think about how we are treating them. If you have a more deflationist view, like the one I'm trying to build, we'll say, well, these are not the main ethical concerns now. The main ethical concerns are about the risk created by actually existing in AI systems, and these risks are multiple, and it kind of direct our attention to the systems that exist today and the kind of harms that they can generate. So that's where I am now. And once again, Charles Stott was invaluable in helping me finding, my own views on these emerging questions. Thanks again.
So you have 5 or 6 minutes for additional questions or comments, if anyone would like to come forward.
Yeah, so Jeff Hinton was awarded a Nobel Prize in physics, right? But he's a computer scientist, but he has some training in psychology. So I'm sure that if we would look into his talks and so on, we would find what are his views about the human minds. But usually what I'm encountering is it's often a view that insists on the limitations of the human mind, right? So drawing our attention. So it's true that AI now, sometimes they hallucinate, yeah, they make stuff up or they get things wrong, or sometimes they're biased also. But then they say, well, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and see how very often we are biased also. And these deep learning systems are very opaque, right? So you cannot, by looking at the computer code, kind of extract the reasons why the AI came up with the particular answer or prediction or advice if you turn to a chatbot to get some. I don't recommend it, but anyhow, they're opaque. And they say, well, yes, but what about us? We're very opaque also. And sometimes when we try to explain or justify what we do, it's exposed, rationalization. We make a story. So I don't have such a bleak view of the human mind. It's true that it's it's limited, our rationality is bounded and so on, but we're social beings also. And when we're in circumstances when we can actually exchange with each other, sometimes confront each other's reason, we're often able to discover better reasons or come up with wiser decisions. So I think that we came up with kind of social solutions and institutions basically to mitigate our very real limitations.